All right, so we're going to be discussing the post-World War I Europe, and really the reason why World War II started was because nobody, like we've talked about, nobody was really happy with the Versailles Treaty. We also have to realize by the end of this presentation, you'll see that by the late 1930s, there were few democracies left on the planet. We'll see that fascism, communism, other types of governments took over, and it was besides the United States and Britain by World War II, those were really the only two democracies left in the world. So it really was a fight for democracy and a fight for you know against fascists. And we'll discuss what fascism is. In the next few slides, so you get an idea of why it was such a threat to America and to Britain and to France. Okay, I just wanted to give you a map of what the world looked like after World War I, on the precipice of World War II. You know, you can see from this map, Poland was created after World War I. The Soviet Union and Germany were not happy about that. They never are happy. Until after World War II, neither of these countries were ever happy that there was a Poland, right? Germany thinks Poland's theirs. Russia thinks Poland's theirs. What have you. The Baltic states were created. The Union, obviously, the Soviet Union was created. Yugoslavia, you can see. So all of these empires got caught up. Turkey is there, Syria, Iraq, Iran. These are all new entities, and these are all places where people, especially the victors of World War I, believe they should have influence in. So this is just a map showing you kind of the post-World War I cut up of Europe, what the Versailles Treaty did. Okay, so first we're going to talk about where fascism actually began, and it was in Italy. We have to remember that after World War I, what came was a lot of anxiety in this lost generation of people who felt like a lot of young men died for no reason whatsoever. You also have in 1929, 1930, 1931, the famous Great Depression, right, that affected everybody. Even into Japan and China, they were affected. All of Western Europe was affected, but the only people who really weren't taken down by this Great Depression was the Soviet Union, because they were not connected with capitalism, right? So capitalism was supposed to right itself, so to speak, and it never really did. Things never really got on track the way they were supposed to. So Joseph Stalin is sitting in the Soviet Union saying, "Ha, look at us. We're bigger and better than we've ever been, and the reason why we are is because we are communists and we are not fascists. Or I'm sorry, we're not capitalists." And so a lot of people who make money or who prosper from capitalism say, all the middle class, doctors, lawyers, merchants, shopkeepers, artisans, everybody who is aligned with capitalism and who likes free trade, they become worried because of this Bolshevik revolution and because the Soviet Union appears to be strong. It appeared to be strong. Little did they know it was not. And so the tendency for a lot of people was to start moving right to the right side of the political spectrum. Okay, it kind of happens when people are scared. They tend to give up some of their liberties for protection. This is just the history of the world. This happens all the time. I mean, after 9/11, we got the Patriot Act, and then we had all of these things, government, being able to arrest people and hold them for 48 hours without charging them with anything. And most people are okay with that because when bad things happen, people tend to let their liberties go. by the wayside. And this is not just America I'm talking about. This is just history in general. And this definitely happened in Europe after World War One and after the Great Depression, right? Everybody was poor, everybody was scared, and so people tended to move to the right of to a more conservative leaning ideology when things like that occur. Um, so what happens in Italy is these vigilante groups, they start fighting with these um, workers unions and workers in the streets, and things are getting in Italy they were called red leagues, kind of these workers unions, and things were getting pretty violent there, and the fasci, FASCI, they were young idealists, and they were virulent nationalists. Okay, when I say people move to the right, and a lot of you have already discussed this, people start moving to the nationalist idea, and they really wanted Yugoslavia. Um, and you have to remember that Italy was on the winning side of the war, and they were basically kept out of the Versailles Treaty, right? They didn't get almost anything they wanted, so you have to keep that in mind as well. They are not happy with democracy or the Western winners either. Okay, and actually, the word fasci is Latin. It's fasci in Latin. It's an axe to the top left. It's an axe surrounded by a bundle of sticks, and it was seen as the authority of the Roman state. Okay, so that's what a fasci is. So out of that comes fascism. So what happens is Mussolini gets these black shirts together and these militias, and they start hunting down communists and workers unions, and they become these virulent nationalists. And this guy Benito Mussolini on the bottom right is the guy who starts fascism, and he basically bases it on three things. Okay, he bases it on statism, which means that the state was declared to incorporate every interest and loyalty of its members. Okay, so in fascism really big on displays and really big on national pride and having these huge gatherings, and everybody's going for the same thing. So his motto was, there's nothing above, outside, or against the state. Okay, so the state trumps everything. There's also the nationalism that we talked about. The fascist idea is nationalism is the highest form of society, and it's a life, it's an organism, and it has a soul, and it's supposed to like transcend personal wishes. It's very organic, right? So what Mussolini is saying is basically the state is like a body, all right, and everybody, just like a body, everything in your body has a role to play, and that's how human beings are also. Everybody in the nation of Italy has a role to play. It's organic, and when they do the right thing for the state, not for themselves, but for the state, that's when good things happen. Okay, so that's the nationalism he's talking about. And then there's also the nationalism that we've already talked about, right? We're Italians, you're not, kind of idea. He's a very violent man, but his whole idea is if everybody feels like they have a part to play, then people remain happy and people will do things for the state. Okay? And the last thing is militarism. Mussolini, who's obviously a military man and never went anywhere, just like Hitler, these guys never went anywhere unless they were dressed in military uniform. Right? Just think, when you think about that, when you see pictures of FDR or Truman and Churchill, and they're taking pictures with Mussolini, or they're taking pictures with Hitler or Stalin, or because Stalin usually wore military as well, right? Everywhere these guys went, they were dressed in military uniform. Okay, and Mussolini's idea is that nations that don't expand will wither and they'll die. And he's saying war is good. It gets men, it gets the nation pumped up to win. It ennobles young men. It regenerates sluggish and decadent people, right? So basically, Mussolini's idea is, hey, if we have a war and you're a degenerate and you're sluggish and you go to war, you're going to get weeded out and you're going to die. He's basically saying people who survive wars are tough. because they survived the wars. And and he said, and the only way you can get that kind of you know, weeding out of society is through war. He's a very, very violent man. Okay. Eh, this is very close, obviously, to communism, because basically communism is a state-run society as well. But the thing about Mussolini is he actually was a socialist, and he didn't like what Stalin was doing in the Soviet Union, so he turned to fascism. So his whole idea is this is not about class conflict at all. This is more about being an Italian or not being an Italian, and being strong and being able to win wars, and not being strong and not being able to win wars. Okay, so right, communism is all about class conflict. Mussolini says there's no such thing. There's the nation, and then there's everybody else. Okay, so he's the guy who comes up with these like exercise programs for fitness, youth camps. He awards moms for making large families. They have rallies, they have parades. So this huge mass participation, right? And really what he does is he's mobilizing people, and he's giving them less political rights. And at the time there were a lot of people I really free thinkers who were criticizing Mussolini, and obviously he doesn't like criticism either, so you ended up usually dead, or you just leave the country as soon as you could. But a lot of people didn't recognize this, right? It's happening a little bit today in the world. You know, people are starting to lose rights, and they're not really noticing it because, you know, just they're implemented slowly, or they're thinking about other things. Okay. Um, so in 1922, he gained support through these black shirts. These black shirts were the violent young men who he had under his leadership. A lot of ex-army guys who would go around and find communists or socialists or unions, and they would beat them up and, you know, throw rocks through windows. Very violent kids, right? They were basically armed squads of fascists, and they were just wreaking havoc on socialists. And he actually won some seats in Parliament in 1922. But at the time, it's still a kingdom. Okay. But by the end of 1922, he actually marches up. He actually isn't there, but his fascist stage a march on Rome. He's actually in Milan, and the king at the time, Victor Emmanuel III, um, since the Italian government was in shambles, quickly says, okay, why don't you become the prime minister, and you can form your own government. And so he does, and then he becomes Il Duce, which means the leader. And so quickly what he does as prime minister is he eliminates political parties, freedom of the press, no free speech, no association, any of the things that we would think of as natural rights living in a Western democracy. Mussolini says, no, we've tried democracy, it doesn't work. We've tried capitalism, it doesn't work. We're going to do things my way. And he takes political rights. He crushes unions. He prohibits strikes. And as we'll see later, much of what Hitler's ideas come from this guy. The only difference between him and Hitler is Mussolini was not anti-Semitic. In fact, there's pretty good evidence that Mussolini actually probably hid quite a few Jewish people who were running from Hitler at the time. So that's kind of fascism in a nutshell. When you call a person a fascist, it doesn't necessarily just mean a reactionary, right? Somebody who just reacts to something. It's a very deep-seated nationalistic, organic idea that we're doing everything for the state. So what? Okay, so what's also going on in Spain at the same time, at the end of the 1930s, is the Spanish Civil War, which is actually one of the most important pre-World War II events that nobody really talks about that often. And basically, what it was this. I'm sure some of you have heard of Francisco Franco. He was an army general, and he led a military revolt against the Republican democratically elected government, and he was supported by the conservatives. And it was a very by the way, this Spanish Civil War was ferocious. Lots of death, and we'll talk about what goes on. But I mean, civil wars are usually the most bloody and the most deadly of all wars, and this was not an exception. Um, Franco's problem is when he did have this military coup, he overthrew the government, but he didn't win control of the entire country. So that's how the Civil War started. A lot of Republicans, they'll be known as the Republicans, tried to fight Franco, and they succeeded in fighting him until 1939. And General Franco himself was he. The people who followed him, they were also most of the Spanish military, mostly Roman Catholic, and they're also known as the Phalange. I don't know if you've heard of this term or not, but that's kind of the name for their government entity, so to speak. Mussolini had the fascists and the black shirts. Franco has the Phalange. Uh, the whole background of Franco is he puts down a labor conflict and a bloody miners' strike for the government. uh, a communist unionized miners' strike happened, and it actually was quite bloody. And the government calls Franco in, and he puts it down. Um, that was in 1933, but the problem is after that, there was more economical problems because due to the Great Depression. And in 1936, the National Front wins some elections, part of the elections. The National Front was kind of like this conglomerate of Republicans and socialists and liberal Democrats, and they were democratically elected. When this happens, Franco says no, and by the summer of 1936, he has a well-planned garrison uprising throughout the country. He got a whole bunch of army garrisons together. They got aligned, and they overthrew the government in 1936, and that's when the country gets divided, and that's when the suppression begins, and it gets really nasty. So on General Franco's side, you have the nationalists, who will become fascist. But the other thing about Franco is, even though he did kill a lot of Spanish, his own people, he probably had, nobody really knows the exact number, but probably close to 7,000 to 10,000 Jewish people from Hitler. So he's also a fascist who was not so much a racist. He was more of a nationalist and didn't believe a lot of the things that he also did not have a great relationship with Hitler, even though they were all fascists. So what ends up happening is in the Civil War, you have nationalists versus Republicans. The Republicans are also known as also had this thing called the International Brigades. If any of you have read Homage to Catalonia by Orwell, the guy who wrote 1984 and Animal Farm, he fights in the Spanish Civil War. Hemingway fights in the Spanish Civil War. Arthur Koestler, I don't know if any of you have heard of him. He becomes a staunch anti-communist. He writes Darkness at Noon, which is a very big anti-communist book, just like 1984 is. But at the time, all of these people came from all over the world to fight fascism. Okay? Probably people from over 50 countries were recruited, directed, and they were organized by the Comintern, which is short for the Communist International, which is the Soviet Union's way of spreading world revolution. Okay, so basically the Republicans, in a sense, were run by the Soviets, whereas the fascists were being run by General Franco. Um, the problem with the International Brigade is they probably had 35,000 or so people who they recruited, they trained them, and then they would send them to Spain, but they had no contract or defined engagement period. So this really becomes a problem, especially as the war progresses. By 1938, the Comintern was kind of ordered to disband and withdraw because the Soviet Union did not want to fight a complete war against Hitler yet, or against Mussolini, or against Franco, because Stalin knew that they weren't ready for it. So in 1938, he kind of tries to disband a lot of these brigades because he wants to stop the fighting, because he thinks if they stop the fighting, then the fascists will stop the fighting, and then Stalin will have some time to build up ammunition, build up heavy industry, because he knew that the Soviet Union was not ready to fight a world war. He thought that maybe if he called back a lot of these people, especially the International Brigade, that Franco would stop fighting. But actually, Franco does not stop fighting. In fact, Franco just turns the screws a little tighter once this happens. And there was also the idea that the Republicans, not just the International Brigade, but all of the Republicans were divided. I mean, you had people as far left as communists, but you also had socialists. You had anarchists. So they were all kind of heavily divided, and they were all kind of fighting for different causes. The main cause was to be anti-fascist, but none of them really could agree on what would happen if they actually kicked Franco out of the country. At the same time, the world community was looking on this Spanish Civil War, and nobody wanted to get involved because nobody wanted to start World War II. So France, Britain, Germany, and Italy, they all signed pacts not to get involved in the Civil War, even though there's obvious proof that the British were definitely giving aid to the Republicans, and as was the USSR, and there's definite proof that Hitler was helping Franco at the same time, even though they've all signed pacts. But what they're not doing is sending their own soldiers in there. Okay, so they're kind of sitting back and doing what the United States did in World War I. They're kind of funding the war, but they're not actually fighting it with their own people. By late 1936, Franco had almost taken over the whole country. He's on the outskirts of Madrid. He laid siege to it, but he just couldn't take it. So the war kind of keeps going on from 1936 to 1937, 1938. It's just bloody. It's partisan, guerrilla warfare. People in the mountains fighting. It was very bloody, but Franco could not take Madrid, which is the capital of Spain. He had basically, by 1938, taken the rest of the country except Madrid. So by early 1939, the Republicans couldn't take the siege any longer, and Franco, they flew to Paris, and they surrendered. So Franco, at the beginning of 1939, creates a fascist state in Spain. Okay, very much based on what Germany was based on and what Italy was based on. As you look back on the war, there's a lot of evidence that Franco could have won it earlier, right? Laying siege to a city for 3 years, but he wanted to kill as many Republicans as possible, because in a civil war, there's winners and there's losers, period. That's how civil wars end. There's no Versailles Treaty. There's none of this. Franco knew that if he was going to win this war, much like any civil war, much like Lincoln knew in the U.S. Civil War, that he was going to have to kill and conquer as many people against him as possible. And in this case, they were Republicans. Um, and the whole point of a civil war is it's not to split political power, right? It's to gain complete control over somebody else who's in your country, and then once the civil war is over, you have to live with each other at the same time. Those who don't lose, or those who don't die, versus those who win, right? So there's also that you got to think of. But over the course of the 3 years, and I'm sorry to go back. So that's why Franco kept the war going as long as possible, just to make sure that he could rid himself of as many people as possible who would be not loyal to him once he took over. And he does a very good job at it. In fact, I think he runs Spain until his death in the mid to late 1980s, right? Spain was fascist for 50 years almost. Yeah, some numbers: close to 500,000 died in the 3 years, mostly Spanish people, but also fighters from all over the world. But it was mostly Spanish people. Um, but the main thing that separates the Spanish Civil War from most earlier wars in the history of Europe is that a lot of these people were civilians because of bombardments, executions, and assassinations. There's also a lot of malnutrition, but nobody really knows how many people died just basically from starving or having no clean water. Um, and this is the real legacy of the Spanish Civil War. It's a very important war for a lot of reasons, because it's pre-World War II, so the ramifications are just this idea of these people who are Republicans and Democrats who are fighting. It's kind of democracy versus tyranny, even though the Soviet Union is backing the Republicans because they're anti-fascist. Most of the Republicans were very much democratic, whether they were socialists or liberal Democrats or conservative Democrats. There's this idea of it's a war of tyranny versus democracy, very much so at the time, or like fascism versus freedom kind of idea. And also it was a testing ground for what was to come. By the end of the Spanish Civil War, World War II had essentially already started. So it was a testing ground for, especially for the Germans, for their tanks, for their weaponry, and for what we'll know as strategic bombing, right? Bombing certain places of the civilian population and trying to do as much damage as possible, whether they're machine factories or what have you. But the Spanish Civil War was kind of this test ground for all of this weaponry that was about to come forth in World War II, and the Germans used it to their advantage, right? It was kind of like a test run for them, right? How many civilians can you kill before people are going to give up? That kind of idea. And this is an idea that we'll talk about later, that World War II is basically the first time in the history of the world where civilians were targeted on purpose and in a very large amount. And the Spanish Civil War is kind of the precursor to all of this. And fascism wins out. All right, so lastly, we're going to talk about Axis aggression that really started World War II. This time around, there's no question that the war was started by the Axis side. And when we talk about the Axis powers, we're talking about Italy, Germany, and Japan. The first one we'll talk about is Japan, because although they don't take over Nanking until 1937, Japan actually invades China in 1931 in Manchuria. And they set up this thing called the Manchukuo government, which was a puppet government. And if you know where Manchuria is, that's kind of northern China. So they set up this puppet government in the north of China and start moving south. In 1933, the League of Nations condemns this, and they tell them to stop. So Japan says, we're just going to leave the League of Nations, and they do, and they don't stop. Um, then they begin to bomb Shanghai, and they get into Nanking, where they behave quite poorly. And this is when the rape of Nanking starts. So by December of 1937, the Japanese are in charge of China. This would be an interesting topic, the rape of Nanking, if you're interested in for your final PowerPoint. There's a lot of information about that, about the rape of Nanking out there, and quite a few books. It was brutal. It was against civilians, and it was an occupation, and it's something that World War II will be about. It'll be about killing a lot of civilians, and it'll be about occupation. Okay, not so much the trench warfare that we saw in World War I. World War II is a very mobile war. All right, people are moving at great distances real quick. And much like World War II, the European side, it's about racial superiority. It's about strategic bombing, and it's kind of about fascism. Japan kind of goes the same way that Europe goes. Once the government lost their mandate after the Great Depression, it was a military takeover, and then after the military took over the government, then they started expanding themselves, and basically they were looking for resources. Okay, the rape of Nanking itself, probably 7,000 women were raped, somewhere in that vicinity. Hundreds of thousands of people are dead. They don't really know the exact numbers. A third of the homes were burned. Probably close to 400,000 total were dead, and a lot of people were used as bayonet practice, right? So this is the Japanese beginning of trying to take over all of Southeast Asia, which they'll call the Southeast Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, right? So this was the beginning of it. And at the same time, while this is going on, this is where the communists with Mao Zedong, this is where they kind of thrive in this guerrilla warfare. So the Chinese government gives up, throws in the towels, and Japan takes over China. And what the communists do, it's not a government, is they become kind of these guerrilla fighters, fighting against the Japanese. In guerrilla warfare tactics. And this is kind of where Mao makes his name, and we'll talk about him more later. But at the same time, in the West, and especially America, nobody's really paying attention to this because they're more worried about the Depression and what fascism is doing in Europe. And what they're really worried about is the expansion of Germany. Before that, in 1935, this was kind of also right before the Spanish Civil War starts. Italy invades Ethiopia, and they attack it using mustard gas, and they also take over Albania. So the British and the French and the Americans are looking kind of at this. They can see that Germany's rearming itself. They can see Italy using mustard gas and really trying to take over Albania, which is close to the Balkans, which is what Italy wants, and they want Yugoslavia at some point, right? And they start moving into Africa, and the West is kind of looking on because nobody really wants war, nobody's really ready for war, so nobody really says anything about it, okay? And then by the end of the 1930s is when Germany starts to really be aggressive. Once Hitler has built this war machine, he starts to use it. In early 1938, he invades, so to speak, Austria, and comes up with the Anschluss, which means connection. And the reason why he invades Austria, so to speak, is because after World War I, in the Versailles Treaty, Austria and Germany the Austria-Hungarian Empire was cut up, and excuse me, Austria becomes its own because it becomes its own country, but it's mostly German-speaking people. So Hitler comes down there with the help of the Austrian government and basically takes over Austria because they're German-speaking people. Um, and Anschluss means connection. And still in 1938, the British are just watching, and France says, hey, okay, since they're German-speaking, we get it, but just don't do any more. Okay? And Hitler says, okay, I won't. So at the end of 1938, he goes into Czechoslovakia, which was created after World War One, and there's a lot of German-speaking people in Czechoslovakia as well. Earlier in September of 1938, he told everyone at a conference in Munich, it's called the Munich Conference, that he tells them that he wants it. And Britain says, okay, you can have it, but you can only have what used to be Germany. Britain says, we understand that you want part of the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia that was taken from you after World War One. So even at the end of 1938, Britain and France are still saying, okay, just they're letting him do whatever he wants because nobody wants war and nobody's ready for war except for Hitler. And so they say, okay, you can have what used to be Germany. They say this in 1938. So Hitler says, okay, I'll just do that. But by early 1939, he just annexes all of Czechoslovakia. And in March, so in early 1939, he annexes Czechoslovakia. In March of 1939, Britain says, if you go into Poland, we will start fighting you. And this makes Hitler furious, right? And so on August 23rd, 1939, Hitler signs a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, which just made everybody gasp because here were the two mortal enemies that everybody knew was going to fight each other at some time, and then they signed a non-aggression pact, meaning that basically probably the reason why Stalin signed it with Hitler because he knew that he wasn't ready to fight him. So as opposed to saying no, you can't have Poland, which Stalin wanted also. Stalin also wants Poland. As opposed to saying, no, we'll fight you for Poland, Stalin says, okay, let's sign a non-aggression pact because we're not ready. And Stalin's thinking is, at some point we will be ready, and then we'll just take Poland back from Germany. So when, in August 23rd, 1939, the non-aggression pact was signed, this is when everybody in the world, even though everybody kind of knew war was starting anyways, this is when they realize that things are about to hit the fan. So a month after he signs the non-aggression pact with Stalin on September 1st, Hitler invades Poland. And 2 days later, Britain and France declare war on Germany because they told Hitler that he can't have Poland. So he invades Poland, they declare war on him. And this is the part of World War II that's kind of called the Easy War because Poland had no idea, the Poles had no idea where Hitler was going to attack, so they divided their army throughout, and literally in a matter of days, the Panzers and the Luftwaffe, the part of the German army, the Wehrmacht, they get to Warsaw, and by September 29th, they had divided Poland. Okay, between Stalin and Hitler has said, well, Stalin says, well, when you take over Poland, I want the east side, you can have the west side. Hitler says, okay, as long as you don't fight me for Poland, I'll give you this part of it. And so on September 29th, Hitler takes the German army, takes over Poland, and Poland is divided. This is, even though it's called the Easy War, it shouldn't have been because the Poles almost had a 1 million strong army. But this is when we get the idea of the Blitzkrieg, which means lightning war, and it kind of had been tested in the Spanish Civil War, and then the Wehrmacht, the German army, in 1939 uses it to extreme effectiveness. Um, Probably 70,000 Poles were killed, 130,000 wounded, 700,000 were captured, and close to only 11,000 Germans were killed in this whole fight, this whole month of fighting. And the whole Blitzkrieg idea of this lightning war is it was a coordinated efforts of tanks, artillery, and aircraft, right? So they would use aircraft to bomb. They're moving quickly. Even their infantry are not walking. They're moving. Not too many of them were walking. They're moving with trucks and tanks and aircraft and artillery, and everybody's moving quickly. And it's with an overwhelming number of troops. And the whole idea of the Blitzkrieg was to get quick, decisive victories. And in Poland, it worked. Okay. Um, so once they take Poland, Germany's next plan is to take France. Same way with the Blitzkrieg, right? They saw that it worked in Poland. They've divided it. They know that Russia's not going to attack. The Soviet Union's not going to attack them because they have a non-aggression pact. So they know they'll only be fighting a one-sided war, right? So then they go and attack France. And we'll talk a little bit about the Maginot Line. So what happens is this. In October 1939, they had drawn up a plan to take Benelux, which is Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, which obviously Belgium is supposed to be neutral, so they're not supposed to go through there. But we've already seen in World War I, people went through Belgium anyways. Hitler's going to do the exact same thing, and it's going to take everybody by surprise again. But the thing about 1939 is everybody thought it would be the Schlieffen Plan again, but it really wasn't. It was actually called, actually Operation Barbarossa's later, but it wasn't the Schlieffen Plan. And by the 22nd of June of 1940, only 9 months after the Germans had taken Poland, they used the same type of tactics that they used in Poland and France, and by the June of 1940, France had signed a peace treaty with Hitler, creating a fascist state. And the reason why, and I'll show you on the next slide what it was, is the French had built the Maginot Line. And when I say they thought it was going to be the Schlieffen Plan again, they thought everybody in France, after World War I, they built what is called a Maginot Line, and it's basically the length of the German-French border. And it's this big tunnel, interweaving tunnel with all kinds of things. You can have a whole bunch of army in there, but it's basically like a really large trench. And so what it was supposed to do was it was supposed to stop the German army from moving in like they did in World War I. But the problem is it ended at Belgium. And so what ends up happening is they build this huge infrastructure of things, and this huge, basically, Great Wall of China, so the Germans can't get over. And all Hitler and the Wehrmacht do is they go around it. They go north of it. They come out on the backside of it, and they take Paris in a matter of months. Okay, and this is when you get the division of France between Vichy, which is the southern part of France, who was run by a fascist French government, and then the north part of France, which was actually occupied by the German army. Okay, so that's the different. So when you hear the words Vichy France, what that is that's the southern part of France that was under French control. They were fascist French, but it was still a French government, whereas the north part of France was made into a German-occupied state. And there's just a ton of movies about this. Casablanca is one of them. even Inglourious Bastards is kind of like that. But there's a whole plethora of movies about this whole German occupation of France, and it took almost no time at all. And this is where, after this happens, General Charles de Gaulle, I'm sure you've all heard of him, he flees to Britain and sets up the French government, the French partisan government in London. And on the next slide, you'll see what the Maginot Line really looks like. So they thought it was going to be World War I fighting again, and they put all their energy and resources into making a huge trench that the German army could not get through, and all Hitler does is just goes around it. And the French army, also almost 1 million strong, folds in a matter of months, just like the Poles did. Okay, so this is kind of the time that's called the Easy War, because Hitler's taken over most of Europe without really anybody even doing anything about it. So after these two huge victories, he sets his eyes on Britain, and he thought Britain was going to be the same thing, except you can't get there over there through land. So what ends up happening is the Battle of Britain, and all that is the Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force, just bombing London, just constantly, day and night. And Hitler believed that all of this strategic bombing, and it was indiscriminate too. It wasn't just strategic. The German Luftwaffe were just dropping bombs over London wherever they could, and they thought that the Londoners would break, but what ends up happening is the exact opposite. It's kind of Britain kind of gets a second wind because of what the German Luftwaffe is doing to London. At the same time, you get Hitler had also underestimated the RAF, the Royal Air Force. And the Brits also came up with this thing called radar, which is radio detection and ranging. That's what the acronym for radar is, which is basically sound waves hitting up, triangulating, hitting off objects, and coming back and seeing where the objects were. So once the Brits came up with radar, then they could shoot down the planes easier. And the Battle of Britain, even though they bombed Britain and it really was effective in a sense, the RAF began to hurt the Luftwaffe, and Hitler was losing more war material than he was actually gaining. So the Battle of Britain kind of ends up being somewhat of a turning point in the history of the war, even though it's early 1940 and the war lasts till 1945. This is when Hitler realizes that it's probably going to be harder to take Britain than he thought. So he kind of ends up not doing that, and he sets his eyes towards the Soviet Union. This is also the time when the British break the Ultra Code with help from the Polish Secret Service, and there's also a whole bunch of movies about that, right? That the British kind of break the German intelligence codes, and they end up knowing it for most of the war, but they don't want to give it away that they know it, so they still allow a lot of bad things to happen because they don't want the Germans to know that they know they've broken the code, which is also a whole nother deal there. So what ends up happening is by the end of July of 1940, Hitler kind of turns his eyes away from Britain, and they come up with Operation Barbarossa, which is, this is when ideology really takes over. And this was the idea that the German army with the Luftwaffe and the SS and everybody else is going to move east, and this is when it starts. This is when his anti-Jewishness really comes, and his racism really comes out. And the whole point of Operation Barbarossa was to destroy Judaism in Europe and to enslave as many Slavic people as he possibly could. And this was led by the Einsatzgruppen, which is the Special Action Forces. So what these guys were these were guys who followed the actual army, and they were in charge of finding Jews, communists, and other undesirables. And this is this is when World War II really becomes a war of ideologies, right? Um, this is when it's fascism versus communism and democracy, all right? And this is when the war starts really, really getting nasty, and when civilians really start dying. Uh, the interesting thing is, since they still had a non-aggression pact, Stalin was very surprised at this, and it took him a few weeks to kind of get a hold of himself, um, to, to set up kind of a resistance. Even though nobody's ever defeated Russia before, this was the biggest threat, even more of a threat than Napoleon's army was at the time. So what it was is, on the 22nd of June in 1941, Operation Barbarossa commences, and it was a 2,000-mile range with almost 3 million troops from top to bottom, and they were all heading east. And there's there's this interesting thing. One Russian who's kind of in a way outpost, way west, kind of in Ukraine, and he tells his commanding officers, "What should we do? We're being attacked." And the reply was, "You must be insane. Why aren't you using code?" Nobody believed that this was going to happen, and here you had 3 million troops heading east in a 2,000-mile line, basically, United States from top to bottom, and they were all moving east, and it was all to find Jews and to enslave Slavs, right? And as we get back into the war, we'll talk a little more about this, but the whole idea is this Operation Barbarossa. As they move east, they conquer and they take over things, and Hitler basically ends up having the same problems that Napoleon had. It's just the Soviet Union is too big, it's too wet, it's too cold. You just don't have the resources to sustain an army there, especially an army of 3 million people, for that long. And really, basically, Stalin ends up doing the same thing that the Russians did earlier. It's kind of fighting this war of attrition. Just keep sending out people to die. And at some point, the Germans will have to leave, because nobody can sustain it for that long. So we'll talk a little bit more about that during the war, and we'll talk a little bit more about what actually happens, like the Battle of Stalingrad and some of the more important battles, and the reason why. At the end of World War II, you kind of had the same thing as at the end of World War I, except it was just the Soviet Union versus the United States, and everybody else is kind of fighting for power in the world. So that is kind of the beginning of World War II and kind of why it occurred. And here's some pictures of the Maginot Line. As you can see, it kind of stops at Belgium, so all the Germans did was they just went around it. And it's a very complicated, very complex, very painstaking thing that they accomplished. The only problem is it was built to fight a World War I battle, and the Blitzkrieg was a very quick-moving, deadly, efficient way of fighting that the Maginot Line just couldn't stop. And this is why France was taken in a matter of months, even with an army of 1 million men. And here's some pictures of the Battle of Britain. And you can see on the left just the damage that was done, and on the right, people, losing their homes and having to hang out in ditches. The interesting thing that here's a big difference between the ideologies of what Britain stood for and what Germany stood for. Whereas Hitler was trying to kill the infirm and the old and people who he didn't think were a part of society, when they started bombing Britain, especially London, the British government helped the infirm and the old and the mentally disabled and the young. They helped them get out of the city because they knew they couldn't do it by themselves. Okay, so it seems like common sense, but when you think about it, that's kind of the crux of the difference between these two types of ideologies, democracy and fascism, is this idea that the British tried to helped these people get to safety, whereas Hitler was was killing them on purpose. So it's kind of an interesting take on how these two ways of thought were different. And here's Operation Barbarossa, kind of the idea of it: move west, then head east, and you can see it's hard to tell how big this is, but that's a 2,000-mile line of just of army moving east, and it was there's a lot of good Soviet movies about this, and this was a Operation Barbarossa, especially moving east. This was a very concerted effort to rid the world of Jews and Slavs, or to enslave Slavs. So World War II is really the first war in the history of the world where civilians were purposely sought after and purposely killed for war purposes. And they hanged a lot of people, and we'll talk a little bit more about the Einsatzgruppen, but they killed so many people that the worst, the hardest thing for them was finding a place to bury all the people. The stink that surrounded them, because there was just so many dead people around them, and they just had nowhere to bury them. So that's the other difference between World War II and any other war before it, is this complete targeting of civilians on purpose. Right, like civilians have died in every war before World War II, but in this one they were targeted specifically because they were civilians, which breaks basically every law of war up to that point and after it.